Started with it. We have a line of presentations lined up. The first one will be by Professor Ed Regge, who will be doing it online. And he will be followed by Dr. Said Payet of the Rockefeller University, and followed by Professor Michael Scholz. And I'll be assisted also in this session by a facilitator, Professor Misha Chagunda from the University of Hohenheim. I hope I said it right. So as we get started, I'm going to request the technical team to assist me as we just do the sound check for Professor Ed Regge, who is online. If we have any glitches, we have a recording ready, which we can also kick it off. So the technical team, for Professor Ed Regge, if he could just say something so that he can greet the audience. Prof. Regge.
Chief guest.
Yes, we can hear you now.
Our other principal guests.
Yes.
Dr. Tadele Desi, the President of All Africa Society for Animal Production, the Executive Committee of the Animal Production Society, and the Local Organizing Committee. Thank you very much for the invitation. Good morning. My name is Ed Regge. I'm currently the CEO of Emerge Center for Innovations Africa, based out of Nairobi. So ladies and gentlemen, I would like to introduce my presentation. My topic is an examination of the political economy of agro-biotechnology in Africa with a specific reference to GM. And really would like to focus on what role we as technicians can play in unraveling the ongoing debate on GM. The outline is as follows: GM and biotech, GM applications and impacts, both in crops and in animal agriculture, GM research in Africa, just an overview of the crops and the traits that we are currently looking at. And then we look at arguments against and for GM foods. And then I will delve into the political economy itself, and then consider what role technicians can play, and then do a summary and way forward. Let me start by saying that ag biotechnology is not, of course, not just GM, as we all know. However, the raging GM debate has overshadowed much of the success that other biotechnologies have actually delivered for us in agriculture, and in fact continue to deliver, such as conventional breeding. The word biotechnology is the bad word in many quarters. So in the process that we find ourselves in, the anti-GM movement is actually being very successful in convincing segments of the world that GM or biotech, even more generally, biotech is dangerous, and that it has not made any and cannot make much contribution to ag improvement. So while my presentation focuses on GM technology, it must be noted that the arguments that we see around are being generalized as arguments against biotechnology, and this is really confusing to the public. And for political correctness, we technicians are increasingly opting out from using the word biotechnology to using biosciences, even when in fact what we mean is biotechnology. It's almost like we are embarrassed to use that word. The GM discourse, I want to say, the GM discourse is really not just about crops. The GM discourse is about food systems, and it includes animal agriculture, and therefore animal scientists as us must engage. A brief overview of the use and economic impacts of GM technology in crop agriculture to date. Overall, we have seen higher yields and income, decreased pesticide use, and reduced food prices, as well as increased human welfare. A comprehensive meta-study has revealed that yield increases recorded have reached up to 22%, and profit margins somewhere between 60 and 70% have been reported. And these profit margins in particular are larger in developing countries, of course, because we are starting from a lower base. Yield increases have reduced the use of land, and therefore the GM therefore is directly contributing to saving our forests and wildlands by producing more produce on smaller acreages. And in terms of acreages around the world, the farming of GM crops has substantially increased from 1996, when we had only 1.7 million hectares, to today, to 2019, the latest figure that I have, where we have 190 million hectares. And you can see the graph on the right, which goes up to 2017. In Africa, only a handful of countries have engaged in commercial GM, and that is South Africa with 2.3 million hectares, Burkina Faso 0.4 million hectares, and Sudan 0.1 million hectares only. I must say now, and I will repeat later, as that this is really focusing on cotton in Africa. So while globally, there are 5 biotech crops that occupy 99% of the crop area under biotech. If you look at Africa, by the way, those crops are soybeans, maize, cotton, canola, and alfalfa. And you can see the acreages there. In Africa, the major crop is cotton, but there is also some work that is happening in maize, cassava, cowpeas, and to smaller extents, potatoes, bananas, sweet potatoes, sugarcane, coconut, squash, and grape. The trends of focus in the research going on in the continent are disease, insect, and virus resistance. But there are also some research projects that are looking at traits that are really crucial to us as a continent: drought resistance and biofortification. In terms of countries, as I've said, only a handful of countries are involved. I mentioned already South Africa, Burkina Faso, Egypt, Sudan, and Eswatini more recently. But I must say here that there has been so much flip-flopping in terms of we are in versus we are out of the GM space that it almost on a yearly basis, the countries involved are changing. So GM crops and food for animals. Do animals actually eat GM crops? Yes, they do. In fact, there is increasing availability of GM animal feeds in terms of soya, maize, and alfalfa. And these, the feeds, that is of real great relevance to us as Africa, because feed represents the biggest input to livestock that is currently constrained, and therefore handling the feed issue is something that we should prioritize. Today, more than 95% of animals used for meat and dairy in the United States actually eat GM crops. And research without a doubt is showing that eggs, dairy products, meat from animals that eat GM food are equally nutritional value, safety, and quality to foods that come from animals that eat only non-GM food. Moreover, the studies show that the health and safety of animals are the same regardless of whether they eat GM or they eat conventional food and feeds. Are GM animals in food supply chain today? Yes. Commercial salmon exists. In the US, commercial salmon has been developed specifically, commercial GM salmon has been developed specifically to address growth to a particular endpoint. In addition, GM pig, so the so-called gun-safe pig, has been produced and approved for use to address allergic reactions by consumers that have problems with red meat. FDA, the Federal Drug Administration of the US, has determined that food from this salmon and food from the pig are as safe and nutritious to eat as food from non-GM salmon and pigs. As a proactive measure, the EU has been developing comprehensive guidelines, even though the EU is quite cautious in terms of approval of GM. They are already developing comprehensive guidelines, in fact have developed comprehensive guidelines for commercialization of GM crops, and now moving towards commercialization of animals as well. But GM in food is actually a very small part of GM more generally. GM in medicines. GM in medicines is a big deal, and we are consuming a lot of medicines today without even asking whether they are GM or not, which means, in fact, we have accepted GM in one way, in one space, and are actually saying no to GM in another. And we know that GM medicines go through very stringent tests, stringent approval processes, wherever they are produced. GM cotton is also widely used in the textile industry globally, and as a matter of fact, the entry into BT cotton in Africa was in fact to respond to that demand for GM cotton in the textile industry. So now let's look at the political economy of ag biotech with specific reference to the GM. So let me start by saying political economy really looks at how the economy affects politics, but also how politics affect the economy. In respect to this discussion today, there's one fact we need to recognize, that political leaders only respond to those changes that can be translated into votes. And moreover, votes now, not votes in the future. And votes for the current election. They're not necessarily interested in objective analysis of what is good for society now and in the future. They are interested in what will get them the votes in these current elections. So the implication of this, ladies and gentlemen, is that the fate of GM technology and the discussions that we are currently engaged in will continue to depend on the level of goodwill that it generates among voters. And therefore, as long as a large segment of the population is apprehensive about the benefits of GM, restrictions on the technology will continue. Currently, the anti-GM movement has effectively focused on convincing the public through fear-mongering, and specifically using misinformation and overgeneralization of very specific findings or even wrong or misguided conclusions based on misinterpretations. Current engagements with politicians by the pro-GM community is needed, is important, but unfortunately is not sufficient. The meetings we have with parliamentary groups and so on will continue to go back and forth, flip and flop. So the pro-GM community must therefore start to rethink and develop strategies that may actually have more impact. And I would like to say that one of them is really being sober, being engaged in and being sober during national, continental, as well as international conversations. Two is participating in critical formal processes. We know that in most countries, we have committees and task forces that are supposed to advise governments on what they can do about technologies such as GM. And currently we know that those who sit in these committees, predominantly, not all, but predominantly those who sit in these committees are nominated by those that actually have already made a decision as to where they want to stand. how can the technicians find their ways into these committees and task forces so that they can provide the evidence needed that can guide informed decisions by these committees and forums and task forces. I would like to say also that we have to really start being objective and being active, but not being seen to be activists in ways that we will then be considered to be just like the anti-GM community in terms of the way they behave. We have to be different. So let me now go to current arguments very briefly against and for GM in a summary form. So there is the argument about biodiversity, that GM crops, a few GM crops will be developed and will occupy large land masses, and therefore will over time replace the diversity of crops and the diversity of animals that we have in our systems. So that's one argument. The other argument is that GM will lead to unsustainable agriculture that depends on natural gas and other inputs like fossil fuels and so on. Then there is the concern that GM will continue to be developed by, controlled and sold by a few large multinational companies that will be controlling the world. And that if we allow GM crops to come into play, then that is going to be the scenario ahead of us. And of course, the more talked about health and safety concerns about GM foods. And with regard to the environment, the concern has been the use of chemical herbicides that are needed in GM fields in order to resist pests. The concern that weeds will develop resistance in these ecosystems, and that there will be loss of biodiversity also in terms of using chemicals that are harmful to insects and pests in those systems. There has been concern about hunger, that GM has done nothing to reduce hunger. I'm saying it now, I will say it again, that that's very interesting to hear, because as a matter of fact, in Africa, for example, we have not allowed GM to do what it needs to do because it is not accepted in the continent. And then there is a final one. There is the issue of GM being a threat to the smallholder, linked to the corporate control, but slightly a different issue. Arguments for GM foods. Let's look at hunger, and let's be open-minded about this. If indeed those yield estimates that I have made reference to earlier are actually true, and they are, because these are large studies, then biotechnology is currently the only way to feed the growing human population by increasing yields to get more food for the population. And because of the high yields, biodiversity can reduce the amount of land under crops or under livestock, and therefore it can sort out the whole issue of moving into delicate, fragile lands, including our forests. Moreover, GM can be used to create, to address climate adaptation by producing stronger crops and breeding stronger, more adapted livestock. GM can also help us to design and produce foods that meet specific needs of the population, whether we are talking about taste or other dimensions of flavor. GM can produce stronger crops, as I have said, and stronger animals. And there's no doubt about this, because we have crops that are resistant to pests, crops that are resistant to drought, and so on. So we know that GM can be used to produce stronger crops and livestock. And then finally, biofortification. GM is in a position to address, and has been demonstrated to address, specific nutritional gaps in the food system. So, ladies and gentlemen, the concern about GM is about risks. Let's not kid ourselves that it is anything else. It is really a focus about the risks to our health, the risks to the environment, the risks to the economy in terms of control and so on. So these are risks. So over centuries, we humans have developed technologies and products that serve us. And we always have, for hundreds of years, recognized the risks that these technologies portend. But what do we do about this? We work very hard to maximize their usefulness and work even harder to mitigate those associated risks and, in fact, then strengthen the positives that they deliver to us. So this is exactly what we should be doing with GM and other biotechnologies. So let's take the automobile industry, for example. Each year, 1.35 million people are killed on roadways from the data that I've found in the literature. And this translates to 3,700 people dying every day from our roadways. And more interestingly and relevant to us is the fact that these deaths are disproportionately higher in our countries, in developing countries. And how has the world responded? The world has responded by dealing with the risks and hazards, improving the technologies, training the users, the drivers, putting in place traffic rules, and enforcing these rules. So, and overall what we are saying is putting in place policies, regulations, legislation, and institutions that will underpin the process of ensuring compliance. That's what we do when we have something we need, but something which has risks. If you look at the human health situation, the human health interventions, medical errors cause thousands of deaths every year globally. The figures I got from the United States indicate that 400,000 deaths occur in that country every year. And that, in fact, these are only, this does not even include deaths that happen outside of hospital, which are not recorded. And again, the response to this is work on the technologies, improve diagnostics, train the medical staff, put in place ethics, put in place rules, put in place legislation, and ensure that there are institutional frameworks that guide not just the production of medicines, but also their use at the hospital level and by patients. So let's look at the GM crops or GM foods in the same way. Interestingly, no deaths have been reported as a result of consumption of foods that have been developed or have been derived from GM products. In addition, over the period that GM foods have been in the market, there have been no occurrences of health issues, live alone death, health issues associated with them. And how do we respond? We respond by saying we don't want GM, stop GM. An interesting thing I found in the literature is that this is a study in 2014. It shows that Americans were once as fearful of pasteurized milk and microwave ovens as they were of GM foods in 2014. Think about that. What does that tell us? What does that tell us about how people think? The whole issue of fear and how people think, particularly of new things. So, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, currently more than 278 million Africans, a fifth of our population, are undernourished. 55 million children under the age of 5 are stunted due to malnutrition. And we know there is worsening climate-fueled droughts that really call for climate-adapted crops and livestock. And moreover, the global rise in fuel and fertilizer prices has made food unobtainable for millions of Africans. So, under this scenario, should we be embracing a technology that can actually address this problem? And instead of being afraid of the risks it portends, do what is needed to address those risks, to mitigate those risks. And let me just say that all disruptive technologies, all the disruptive developmental breakthroughs have downsides. And the more disruptive it is, the more potential it has, the more downsides will be associated with it. What we do usually is to look for ways, as I have said earlier, to harness the benefits, while at the same time managing or mitigating those risks. GM technology is in that frame. It is disruptive, but it has potential to deliver significant outcomes and impacts. And let's accept, it has risks, and we need to manage these risks. Let us, as technicians, play our part in helping manage the current politicization of the GM technology. Researchers and research institutions must desist from being overly defensive, overly arrogant, and being fanatics, whether in terms of supporting, being an anti, or being a pro in this debate. Technicians have a crucial role to play in helping shape the political economy of the GM technology. The research community, that is ourselves, we must organize ourselves and enter the conversation as informed, objective, mainstream players and avoid extreme intellectualism and extreme fanaticism. We have to be sober as we enter this debate, but we have to enter this debate more intentionally than being sidelines or sitting on the sidelines. So here is my summary in terms of way forward. In 2016, a study was conducted by the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering and Medicine of the US. This study actually had been started way back, I think, in 2014. It involved looking at 900 previous studies of GM crops. It took over 2 years, and it involved intensive input of 20 plus scientists, researchers, as well as industry experts. It was based on 20 years worth of data, basically starting way back since GM crops were introduced into the system. What were the findings? GM crops are safe for human consumption, and there is no evidence of the negatives that are being claimed against GM. Those negatives are not supported by evidence. That was the conclusion. And between 2016 and to date, there have been other studies. One of them is the one that actually has just been developed, has been published in 2022. The coalition was the International Science Organizations on Crop Biotechnology Safety. It involved 284 institutions, and it looked at 3,000 studies, more than 3,000 studies. 284 science institutions looking at more than 3,000 studies. If you look at the map, there's a map there on top of that slide. You will see a 9 on the African continent, a number 9 on the African continent. That number 9 cluster includes the Third World Academy of Sciences, and it is assumed that because Africa is a member of the Third World Academy of Sciences, therefore this is what Africa is saying. But let me go specifically to the 10 the 10 clusters of institutions. The American Medical Association conclusion: there is no scientific justification against GM, and therefore no need to specifically even label it as a separate food line. That's what they were saying. The American Association for the Advancement of Science, the science is quite clear. GM technology is safe, basically. The National Academy of Sciences, the US, to date, more than 98 million acres of GM crops have been grown. There is no evidence of human health problems. Food Standards Australia and New Zealand, same. No issues with GM. The French Academy of Science, same conclusion. The Royal Society of Medicine, same conclusion. The European Commission, same conclusion. That is the EU, despite their cautious stand around these new technologies. The Union of German Academics of Sciences and Humanities, same conclusion. 7 of the world's academies of sciences, Brazil, China, India, Mexico, the Third World Academy of Sciences, which includes an African voice, the Royal Society and the National Academy of Sciences of the US, same conclusion. The World Health Organization, WHO, same conclusion. So ladies and gentlemen, what is going on here? Let me, as I close, say the following. The African voice and the African analysis is missing. I've just presented that summary, and you could see that other than assumptions that the Third World Academy represents Africa, there is no African voice in that analysis. Where are the voices of African scientists? Us, that is us. Where are the collective voices or even individual voices of our universities, our National Agricultural Research Institutes? Where, more importantly, where is the voice of the African Academy of Sciences? Can this academy put together a team and do a study that is really African and that is based on the context of Africa? That's a question that we should take away from here. Way forward. We know that the reactive and defensive approaches by the pro-GM community has not worked. We need a more systematic, proactive approach. I mentioned here the OFAB model, the Open Forum for Ag Biotechnology in Africa model. Can we work with the OFAB model, or do we need an alternative model to address this challenge? I propose 4 things going forward. 1, let's as scientists accept that there are risks, because there are risks. 2, let's invest in research, looking at policy also, regulation, and institutional interventions in this space. 3, let's listen with open mind and address very objectively the questions that are being raised. I know we have been doing that, but we can do more. 4, let's generate more data. This is linked to the previous one. Let's generate more data on improved nutrition, pest resistance, drought tolerance, increased yields, new products. And let's look at data that can objectively counter the unfounded claims. And finally, the 3-legged communication. Let's communicate, and communicate. 3 legs because we need the message to be right. We need to use the voices of messengers that we think can be heard, and we need to be at the right table, the right forums. And finally, one key message that I really want to talk about here as I close is, let's make our institutions work. Let's think about the institutional arrangements that will address the problems that we face with regard to GM technology. Last year, myself and some colleagues put together a comprehensive analysis of ag biotech in sub-Saharan Africa, and I recommend this for you to look at. It looks at the applications of biotechnology in crops, livestock, forestry, and agriculture. And it also examines the capacity available in the continent, the capacity needed, and the means by which that capacity can be organized, harnessed, and delivered to address some of the challenges that this presentation has covered. I thank you. Thank you very much again to the organizers, and may God bless Africa. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Ed Rege, for a riveting presentation and making a case for agricultural biotechnology. That.
Good morning.
Hello.
To our chief guests.
Prof, I would request that maybe you stay online for a bit. Prof. Rege, I request that
Executive Committee of the Animal Production Society.
That's a recording. I think it needs to be stopped.
Local organizing committee.
Okay, sorry for that interruption. I think we've had a riveting presentation from Professor Rege, presenting to us a case to say there's no reason to be skeptical about products of modern biotechnology, and saying there are risks in any technology, but they need to be managed. And also importantly, that there are no African voices. Because of time, I saw that he utilized most of the time. I just want to invite just one question from the audience so that he can react to it, because we also want to have some dialogue. We'll have another session, of course, towards the end where we have a general discussion for all the presentations. Is there any burning question? I see a hand. I'll recognize that hand, that only hand at the back.
Greetings, everyone. Thank you for the brilliant presentation by Professor Rege. My question is the experience around the taste of the genetically modified crops or products. Normally, when you compare it to the original taste, it's not the same. Like we hear the grass-fed beef of Botswana that the minister has talked about earlier. So normally the taste of the original meat or crops is not the same. So those of us who eat for leisure, not necessarily for the bulk, there becomes an issue there. So if Professor can help us a bit around the taste. Thank you.
Thank you. That was the only question that I was allowing, and I'm just going to ask Professor Rege just to respond to that one in the interest of time so that we can proceed for the next presentation. Prof, any reaction from you with regard to that? There will be an opportunity at the end for a broader discussion, so that's why I'm limiting interventions now. Prof, if you had the question that in terms of taste, the products of modern biotechnology, some of them are not as good as our conventional foods. What do you have to say in relation to that? Okay, it looks like the Prof is offline. We will we'll bring up these things for general discussions, because they are experts here in the same field here who can also come to the discussion. At this juncture, I will proceed to the next presentation by Dr. Said Paez from the Rockefeller University, who will be presenting on gender injustice and increased participation of youth in animal agriculture, an exclusive African dream. Over to you, madam.
Do you know if there's is this the pointer?
That's the point, yes.
Okay.
I think to move forward.
Okay, let's see. Let's see, I think there'll be a presentation. Perfect, pulled up. Hola, buenos dias. Hello and good morning. I am very honored to be here today, and I want to thank Professor Desi, Dr. Moreki, Professor Bongo, and all the organizers for inviting me, and to all of you for having me. And as a cisgender and first-generation Dominican American, I think they'll pull it up. Yes, thank you, on the slideshow. Thank you. As a cisgender and first-generation Dominican American, I want to acknowledge the shoulders I stand on today. My ancestors, the Taínos, who are the indigenous people of Quisqueya, the land known as the Dominican Republic, as well as my ancestors from the continent of Africa, particularly the land known as Mali. I am also thankful to the Lenape people of Manhattan, what is known as Manhattan today, where the Rockefeller University sits on, as well as New York University. My talk is on decolonizing science and social justice as an approach to address the elusive African dream of sustainable animal agriculture. And let's see. Hello, Professor. Let's see how. I'm not sure the clicker's working to advance. May I have some technical assistance, please? Well, while that's happening, I do want to address that in speaking about decolonizing science, we're going to be considering today, let's see if it works now. No, but maybe someone can come and help me in the meantime. But I want us to consider who belongs, who is represented, and who benefits in these spaces of animal agriculture in Africa. The topic of decolonizing science can be really difficult for many of us because of the historical injustices, as well as the lived experiences of continuing inequities today that suggest that science is a space where some belong, some are represented, and some benefit, but others do not. I wonder if it's the clicker, and so perhaps, I don't know who's managing the screen, I can just say next. Now, try? Okay, perfect, thank you. Who do we think belongs, is represented, and benefits in science? What does our social, political, and our cultural climate of science tell us about who belongs, who's represented, and who benefits? And do our actions match our beliefs? And as we consider this, I want us to take a moment collectively here now to pause, because I want to invite you to bring your full selves to the room, not just your bodies, but your minds, your emotions, your hearts. Because when we think about challenging and transforming the culture of science, it's going to require more than our thinking. As people in science, we're so used to thinking about the data, the evidence, that we forget that there's also culture that's a part of this. And so I want us to bring our full selves here today. And remember that we're creating brave spaces for all to be included. And I say brave because science hasn't been a space that is safe for many people, and yet they show up. I also want us to remember that while this work is difficult, we are capable of bringing the dream we envision together into a reality. So first we're going to recognize, or I will briefly address why recognizing, challenging, and transforming the inequities and injustices in animal agriculture are not easy or simple to understand. Second, we will consider what we can do to move from awareness to action to address the root causes of structural racism and systemic oppression across the Western scientific enterprise. And then we'll explore where we intersect with the why and the what to meet the challenges with our own privilege. Okay, as we know and as we heard from Professor Reggie specifically on biotechnology, there's many challenges that have weakened Africa's food security and sustainability. And these inequities and injustices are not simple nor easily understood. I want to give you some examples of what the data shows in who belongs, who is represented, and who benefits, beginning with who belongs. And there's many ways to consider who belongs in science. Representation via demographics is one way. So this figure is looking at US population with the US science and engineering population. We see males in yellow, females are in green, and then Asian males, Black males, Hispanic males, as well as females are in the other color. And what we can see is that there are less females as well as Asian, Black, and Hispanic males and female in science and engineering compared to the US population, but we see the opposite for white males. There's more white males in science and engineering than there are in the general population. And this gap isn't new. And so what we see here are the females are in purple and males are in orange. And this is looking at data from 2008 to 2016. And we can see that there's been a steady rise in the number of females in science and engineering, but the gap between females and males remains the same, or continues to be a persistent gap. And when we look at global figures on diversity in females versus, it went away again. Okay, so when we look at women as a share of researchers globally, we see that we have a persistent problem here as well. The figure on the left is showing by region. Females are in orange and males are in green, and this is looking at different regions. And we can see that there's a vast discrepancy between females to males. The figure on the right is looking at more recent data from 2020 for 127 countries. The countries that are in gray simply don't have data represented here, and that includes Canada, the US, Malawi, Zimbabwe, and a few other countries. And for the other countries that do have data here, we note that the colors that, or the countries that are in the lightest purple are those that have the least percentage of women as a share of researchers. So we can look at the continent of Africa and see that quite a bit of it is in the lightest shade of purple. And there's many reasons contributing to why there's a gender diversity gap or problem in the sciences. And so here we're looking at data science professionals as one example. And we can see that while we start with 55% of university graduates as females, by the time they enter the workforce, that's decreased to 15 to 22%. And there's different analogies or thoughts behind why this is happening. This is one analogy. It's called the leaky pipeline. And it's used to explain what might be happening, which suggests that we enter science at one end, and then we follow this pipeline or this path to exit at the other side. And so this analogy is one way to look at what might be happening. And what we see is that females are less likely to receive the same opportunities as males at all throughout this pipeline. And so they're leaking out of the system. And the same analogy holds for students. And so while this might be a little bit difficult to read, what we have on the left side is all the potential students that might be interested in STEM, and then many leak out so that at the end we have less than 20% that continue in science. So while this analogy is helpful to a degree because we can quantify what is happening at each stage, it doesn't truly help us because it doesn't capture the unique experiences of every scholar. It suggests that people are leaking out of science because of passive things, which removes our responsibility to do something about it. So it's distracting from the structural problems that exist in our institution. People are being excluded because of practices and policies, and we need to consider that within the context of scientific racism, colonial legacies, and systemic biases. So let me show you a different model, which is considering that any obstacles are not just passively in place and because of poorly maintained infrastructures, but instead because barriers have been deliberately placed or at the very least unconsciously put in place and sustained. So here we see that for the white male, there are directional signs and things to help on the path to career achievement, but for the Black woman, there are barriers that have been put in place for the same path. We can also think about discrepancies, not just in who belongs, but who is represented. And so here, looking at biodiversity, we can see that there's differences in how we value nature. So biodiversity, as we know in this room, provides many services, supporting roles of soil formation, provisioning roles of food, water, and regulation, regulating roles of climate regulation, and cultural roles of aesthetics and spirituality. But there's differences in the value of nature. Some say that it's intrinsic and we shouldn't even put a price tag on it. But for others, we do put a price tag on it. When we look at the bioeconomy, it represents a significant amount when we think about food and water and other sectors that are contributing, totaling quite a bit of money, $23.5 billion in 2017. But is there a price tag on nature, and is that something that we as scientists and people in science should be thinking about? And so I want us for a moment to think about ethics, and I'm inviting you to actively hear, not just your body, but your brains, be thinking about this as we go through it. So ethics is a set of concepts and principles that guide us in determining what is right and what is wrong. And it systematizes this idea that can be exchanged with goodness and rightness. But what are those things? What is the science of the ideal human character? Ethikos, the Greek word, means relating to one's character. And so it asks us to consider the lens in which we view the world. What assumptions shape how we view the world? Are we even aware of those assumptions? Or are those assumptions so integral to who we are, we don't even consider them when we're making decisions? So while you might be here, your colleagues and friends are here, 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 and here. And they're also thinking about what is good, what is true, and what is real from their perspectives. And this understanding of how we view the world is called a worldview. It's a set of basic beliefs and assumptions that describe your reality. So it's not something you're born with. Instead, it's something that you gain over time because of your life experiences. And so no two individuals will have the same worldview, although we may have things in common. We call this a collective or societal worldview, and as people here in animal agriculture, there may be some things we have in common. And it relates to your worldview. Because it guides your beliefs that lead to your actions in determining what is right and what is wrong. So we don't see things as they are, we see them as we are. So I want you to consider, for example, two worldviews. This is the great chain of being. That's a top-down divine design that suggests that we start with God, progress to humans, and end up with rocks at the bottom. And in contrast, we have another worldview, the evolutionary history of life, that suggests that biodiversity emerges as a result of naturally occurring processes of biological evolution. So this is a bottom-up design where the modern humans are descendants of a common ancestor. So your worldview and your ideas about ethics, about what's right and wrong, will guide you in determining which of these, if any of these, is correct. For example, do we live in a material world that we describe by scientific findings, or is there a spiritual world outside of science that maybe explains what's happening? Do humans belong to the world, or does the world belong to humans? For example, do we have an obligation to protect Earth's natural resources, or was it put here for our own needs? So understanding that each of us holds a worldview guides us in determining what is right and wrong, and it's important when we think about whose opinions are represented in science. So here we're looking at there's different ways to consider whether we're living from, in, with, or as part of nature. And so you might be anthropocentric, which places humans as the most important, or ecocentric, where humans are placed in a stewardship role, or perhaps pluricentric, where humans live in harmony with nature. And so funding bodies, industries, governments, academia, citizens, indigenous peoples, and local communities will all have a view on what they think the relevance of nature is. And if we include this diversity of thought, it will be helpful towards finding a solution, but are we doing that? So many interested parties, many perspectives in fulfilling the scientific potential of animal agriculture. What I've shared with you now, and I hope you're thinking about with ethics, is many of us are going to be thinking we're right, others are wrong. Where does the truth lie? What do we consider knowledge? Whose knowledge do we include in the decision making? And who has the position and the power in making those decisions? In our audience today, and thank you to Kat Lego for her help with these figures and these data, we have a variety of countries attending and various career statuses. And so what I want you to think about from your own position is all of Africa here today. Do we have all of the voices and all of the perspectives that would be helpful towards answering the grand challenges that lie before us? When we think about women in agrobiodiversity, we already know that a vast majority of them are the livestock keepers. And with that, they're the ones that hold the local knowledge and culture for indigenous breeds along with the genetic material. But their role has not been appreciated. And as one example, are we missing out on that because we're not bringing them in as much as we should? Another set of challenges lies in thinking about who benefits. And so here, this animation is showing European colonialism from 1492 to 2008. And I show it simply, as I'm going to lead you into a couple of examples, to highlight that along with colonizing lands, it's also bringing ideas of ethics and worldviews into decision-making. For example, today there's still continued exploitation and extraction of wealth and abundance of the natural resources in Africa. We know this. We know this in petroleum, nickel, gas, gold, and cobalt. But I want to take you to a scientific example of how this exploitation and extraction is happening in science. Eponyms are when scientific species names based on real or imagined people are assigned to a species. And they stake a claim as to which knowledge system is legitimate or important. And while it's positive in one way because it's recording what's happening politically and socially in the time, it's hurtful because the act of naming a species after someone is unambiguously a political act. And so what you see in this graph here, on the x-axis are countries, and on the y-axis are the number of eponyms. And these are species that, again, are named after real or imagined people. So in pink, for example, we have academic names. In yellow, we have species that are named after army officials. And when we look at Africa, over 1,500 species are named after other people that are non-Africans and are eponyms. So this idea of claiming, of colonizing, is also seen in biopiracy, which is this idea that life can be patented. And the commodification or the selling of nature, when nature is regarded as an asset and it becomes part of the flow of goods and services and wealth, is one form of scientific colonialism. But remember that natural resources like seeds, plants, and animals were traded long before the arrival of patents and intellectual property. They're not inventions. And as our technology continues to improve, physical specimens, once sequenced, are becoming digital sequence information, or DSI. And what we're seeing is, with the absence of access and benefit sharing arrangements between providers and users of genetic resources, there's differences in opinion about what's right or what's wrong. For some people, digital sequence information signals a new era of open source gene banks to address our challenges, but to others, it's a new threat of biopiracy. So what can we do to move from awareness of these challenges to action? Justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion are a set of principles collectively known as social justice that offer us an approach or a different way of thinking. And what I want us to think about is, how can we shift our way of thinking to prioritize social justice? So I want to define quickly for all of us, to make sure we're on the same page with some of these terms, have some working definitions. A lot of times we'll hear equality confused with equity. Equality, and this is an example here, we have 3 individuals who are trying to have an opportunity to access watching a football match, but there's a fence, a wooden fence in the way. Equality would suggest that everyone gets the same exact support. In this case, you can see that the first and second individual get a box and can see the match, but the last individual cannot. Instead, we want to think about equity, which factors in the differences among people. So in this case, the tall individual doesn't need support, the one in the center needs a little bit of support, and the one on the end needs more support. And in this way, every individual has an opportunity to access and participate if they want to. We want to move beyond thinking about the individuals and what supports individuals' needs, because that is short term. We want to think more systemically and structurally, which is justice, when we are addressing the root problems that are leading to the need for support in the first place. We're going backwards. So in this case with justice, we see that we've replaced the wooden fence with a chain link fence, and in this way, every individual has an opportunity to access the match. When we think about diversity and inclusion and plus, we think about these as drivers towards justice. So diversity is all of the way in which people differ. It's not just the way that we look, it's the way that we think, it's our religious upbringing, it's all of our culture. And it's not a strategy by itself. Inclusion is when we actively bring people into the process to make decisions. And plus are all of the unknown factors that we may not even yet be aware of. So diversity is like we have a bunch of puzzle pieces, and inclusion is when we bring them into the picture or onto the table to be a part of the conversation. So we want a diversity of people and perspectives, thinking about equity in policy, practice, and position, so what individual support do these people need, so that they can be included in power, voice, and the organizational culture to lead towards justice where everyone has an equal and equitable opportunity to participate. So in this last Venn diagram, let's see. Okay, we're gonna skip to this. So let me present to you, as you're thinking about all of the interested parties and all of the perspectives, a framework that's from a paper coming up with a colleague, Anne McCartney, and myself. And what you're seeing here is that we're proposing that there's 3 different lenses that interact in a system together. So instead of thinking about the science on its own and on the side, we want to think of it more similarly to a kaleidoscope, where these things are interacting in many to many configurations. So we have justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion as the first lens, people as the second lens, and then the science or steps of a project as the last step. So by thinking about this as a system of lenses, what I want you to appreciate is that it's many to many relationships. There's no prescription or pipeline that we can give to check off that we have been just and inclusive of people. We need to be continuously reflecting and reorienting to what is happening in our programs, our projects, and our policies. So we want to center the first lens, justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, as a critical part of every part of our decision making, to shift our approach in how we engage with interested parties, from the individual to all the way to society, as we pursue just and equitable access and benefit sharing in developing, building, and transforming Africa. So as we're heading towards the last part of my talk, I want us now to make it personal, to think about where do we intersect with the what and the why of this. As we talked about a little bit earlier, we all bring our social cultural identity into the room, whether we're aware of it or not. It's part of how we function. And it affects our worldview and positions how we're going to approach research and thinking what is right and what is wrong. And so in this room, we have a plurality of knowledge, of system of ideas, of how we look at nature and the origin of the universe that goes into every level of the decision-making processes. And so by embedding justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion into the system and centering it as the most important, we have an opportunity to be specific and creative to what our programs and projects need. So again, instead of thinking about it as it's a check mark or a list, we have to really think about where along the different steps of our programs can we embed this. So this is from a paper with, again, my colleague Anne McCartney and some other colleagues and myself, looking at the typical steps of a data life cycle and where can we intersect. So for example, can we bring in conceptual lenses of narrative? How might my own beliefs and my organizational beliefs play a role here? What is socio-technical systems? How are people connected to the technology they're using, or how are they not connected? Positionality, what is my specific knowledge and what other knowledge is missing here? And power, do I myself have power, or do others have power, and are we using that power to create more space for others to be a part of this? So along this pipeline, for example, or this roadmap, we can consider, if we bring in women in agriculture, for example, where might we bring them into the process that we haven't been doing so already? And so I want to give you one example with youth in America. So this is a program called 4H, which stands for Head, Heart, Hands, and Health. And what this program does is, through a process of experiential learning, it aims to make youth into lifelong leaders. And so what it does, it's a community of more than 100 public universities that has been providing experiences for youth across agriculture, civic responsibility, science, and health. And they go through a process of doing, reflecting, and applying. And so at each step, we're considering how does justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion play a role here? So beginning with the experience and bringing in culturally relevant activities and thinking about the social political climate and education, going towards the actual doing and reflecting throughout that process to consider how social justice and equity plays into this, and then ending with collective action of how can you continue this moving forward. And so now I want to invite you, as you've heard just this couple of examples, what role can each of you play? I don't know all of you, obviously, but you do know where you are, what your power is, what your position is, and where your privilege is. And so I want you to think about where you are as an individual and the systems or structures that you're within, and what policies and practices are in place at your institution, and what structural systems are in place, and where do these intersect, where you can use your power and position to meet someone else's oppression and bring about real change. And so again, in our audience today, we have a variety of countries, we have a variety of current career statuses representing Africa. Where do we and what role can we play in creating the kind of trustworthy, respectful, and kind relationships that are going to be needed in order to transform animal agriculture? Today, I briefly highlighted why recognizing, challenging, and transforming these inequities and injustices are not simple nor easy to understand. I talked a little bit about what we can do to move from awareness to action through justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, social justice collectively, and how it helps us to shift our thinking by prioritizing justice before the science or as part of the science, and where might we then fit into this intersection of the why and the what to create real change. There's a quote here from 4-H, this is their pledge, and I think it's kind of telling and can also fit for what we're trying to do here this week. I pledge my heart to clearer thinking, my heart to greater loyalty, my hands to larger service, and my health to better living for my club, my community, my country, and my world. And in this way, I think the dream really is not elusive, but it's a hope for the future. We can lead a paradigm shift from the fields to the tables, grassroots to legislations, from dreams to reality, to make this dream of sustainable animal agriculture for, by, and with all Africans a reality. And so I want to say gracias, Asante. Thank you for having me here today. Very much. I appreciate you.
Thank you. We had a very good presentation, which was painting a picture to us about the imbalance in terms of gender and our worldview, how it's shaped by the environment that we grow in, and that we are not helpless about the changes that are taking place, that we can do something about this, and that in the heart of it all, let us make justice an essential ingredient of our intervention so that we can be more inclusive and contribute positively to the worldview. As you've seen, it shows that probably we should be doing more in terms of making sure that especially women are part of the discussions. You've seen the leaking pipe, that analogy that has been presented to us. So in the interest of time, while we digest the content of this presentation, we'll move on to the last one by Professor Michael Scholes, who's going to tell us about the role of science in transforming and achieving future sustainability of African agriculture. Professor Scholes hails from the Republic of South Africa. He's been working for a long time in the ERC. He will tell us a bit about himself as he gets on to give his presentation. Over to you, sir. So we are leaving the talk being more helping others so that they can do their best. Thank you, Prof.
It's normally here when I don't have enough hands, but I'll try to manage. Is this screen working or should I look there? It doesn't seem to work. Okay. Thank you for the invitation. It's really an honor to address you here, and I would like to have my first slide, if you don't mind. I may be controversial, but I think I'm at the age that I can say what I want to say without fear of jeopardizing my career. As indicated there, I'm going to talk about the role of science. And I think science is based on three legs. It must be based on facts, it must be relevant, and it should be interpreted appropriately. Now to get this thing, oh, there it is. So, okay, as I said, science must be evidence-based. And the bottom line is, whatever information, strategies, or decisions we take, we need science to support it. It must be relevant, and we should interpret it and apply it correctly, and that's why science is important if we want to look at future sustainability. I'm going to mention a few flawed scientific examples. The first one is the livestock's long shadow. Then I'm going to say something about the carbon footprint, the IPCC's formula for estimating greenhouse gases, and then specifically to South Africa, but I think it's important that I say something about it, is the claim that diatomite can be used to kill ticks. The livestock's long shadow that was published in 2006 indicated that livestock is responsible for 18% of the world's greenhouse gases. I did meet Steinfeld a few years after that book, and I asked him, but why did you quote only selective articles? Why didn't you look at all the articles? He said, well, the FAO identified these 20 articles, and I summarized these 20 articles. But he didn't look at the other 20. I don't think that is applying science correctly. The value was later scaled down to 14.5%. But now I want to show you other estimates. In 2010, it was estimated that livestock production contributes to 3.4% of the US greenhouse gas emissions, much lower than the 14.5%. In 2018, there was an estimate that the total agricultural sector worldwide contributes to 10% of the greenhouse gases, and there was also one that indicated that livestock and manure contributes to 5% of the total greenhouse gas emissions. So my question is, why don't we interpret scientific results correctly or appropriately? I think sometimes we are influenced by other issues that is not science-based, but that may have a social impact. There's also the issue of the water footprint of beef production. In 2010, there was an article that indicated you need 15,500 liters of water to produce 1 kilogram of beef. There were two assumptions. The first one is that it takes 3 years to produce 200 kilograms of beef. Well, I think in South Africa and Botswana, we can do that in between 14 and 18 months. We don't need 3 years. Furthermore, the rainfall on that property was 1,200 millimeters per year. All the rain that fell on the property was ascribed to the meat production, but 85% of the water would run down in streams and rivers. You can't link that to the meat production from that area. In the same year, there was a publication that indicated you need 540 liters of water to produce 1 kilogram of beef. So the difference is between 540 to 50,500. Why that big difference? Is because we don't distinguish, or the researchers don't necessarily distinguish between the different waters. You get blue water, green water, and grey water. I'm going to say more about it later on, and I see there's a session in which a lot of the water, with a number of presentations on the water footprint. Okay, the IPCC developed formulas for the estimation of greenhouse gases. The problem with these formulas is they are based on generalized assumptions, And there are two examples. It was found that using the IPPC Tier 2, that greenhouse gas emissions in Senegal in dry season was overestimated by 76%. So it's clear that the IPPC Tier 2 equation is not applicable to Senegal, because a cow in Senegal may weigh 130 kilos, and in North America, 500 kilos, but the formula does not take that into consideration. An example that we found in South Africa, where a student used that, she looked at Angus Bonsmara crosses in the feedlot compared to the Nguni in the feedlot, and she found that the carbon footprint of the Angus Bonsmara crosses were much higher than that of the Nguni. We know it's impossible, but the IPPC does not take the feed intake of the different genotypes into account, as well as the efficiency and the growth rate. Because the Nguni weighs less, doesn't mean it has a lower carbon footprint. You should look at the amount of feed, of meat that's produced from the meat in relation to the methane. And this one is an interesting one. It's claimed in South Africa that fossil shell flour can be used to control ticks. And it's scientists that's involved in these claims. And there are the three articles that they are quoting. The first one is from 1979 that says these fossil shell flour is Mother Nature's bug killer. It was published in Organic Gardening. Second one is a 1972 article, which is a natural earth that controls insects, again published in Organic Gardening and Farming. And then there's an article published in 1930. And they use those three articles to say because this fossil shell flour kills bugs in the soil or in pots, if you mix it with a cattle lick, it will also kill the ticks. But they should do proper scientific research to prove it, not use things like this to claim something that is clearly not applicable. Okay, so what are the issues for African agriculture? The first one, I think it's been mentioned many times, there's low production levels. Unfortunately, there's a lot of food loss and waste in Africa, which we should also look at. Then, of course, we need environmental sustainability in the view or in the reality of climate change, and that includes the biodiversity and how we use our land. So from the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, I think there are three issues that's important for Africa. It's food security and nutrition, livelihoods and economic growth, animal health and welfare, and then, of course, climate and natural resource use. So what is important for African agriculture? As I already mentioned, we need decisions that are evidence-based with relevant indicators. The research is fundamental to ensure future sustainability for African agriculture. And we should do research in Africa that's applicable to Africa if we want to address the issues of Africa. We need collaboration between regions. That's important. I see CARDESA. CARDESA should take the lead and say, how are we going to collaborate between the NARDI and the Agricultural Research Council of South Africa? Is there a formal agreement that can guide our collaboration? Not that I'm aware of. Also important, no single country organization or industry can do the research on its own. We tend to work in silos. It's not going to work. And we should combine our efforts and involve expertise from outside the region, if possible. Okay, I think there must be more emphasis on global South scientific collaboration. And you know, during the recent United Nations General Assembly and a few other meetings that took place, I heard the term Global South. And I thought, which countries are the Global South countries? Well, it's all the countries in red there. They are not in the Southern Hemisphere. They are underdeveloped or developing countries. Why they call them global south, I don't know. But at least I think we as the global south countries should expand our collaboration. And we should establish virtual centers of excellence. And if we have these virtual centers of excellence, I'm sure we'll be able to source much more international funding. You know, the developed world in the temperate areas are producing the most greenhouse gases through transport and manufacturing and things like that. So they are causing climate change that is negatively affecting the global south countries. We must access some of those funds to assist us, and we can only do it if we have global centers of excellence and proper collaboration. So I think I've said most of that, but there's no simple uniform mitigation or adaptation strategy for climate change. In Africa, we'll have to look at a number of things. The solutions for Europe and North America may not be applicable to Africa, and we're already suffering from climate change in Africa, and that's why we need science-based interventions. And I see climate change with three legs. It's adaptation, mitigation, and resilience. In the temperate developing world, they concentrate on mitigation. I think for us, adaptation and resilience may be more important than mitigation. Then I've identified 13 science-based interventions. You ask me why 13? I don't see 13 as an unlucky number. I think it's a lucky number for Africa because that is what we should concentrate on. The first one is the use of our, and who's moving? Can I have the next slide, please? Okay. I see our indigenous breeds as Africa's heritage for food security. In many cases, we've neglected our indigenous breeds. We should rediscover them. Why? They are adapted to the local conditions. They've got a meat quality, or most cases, and they are better adapted to survive under the local conditions. And we've also found that their fertility and growth is less affected by heat stress. I've got a presentation on that later in the week as well. The second one is the development of early warning systems. Why do we need early warning systems? If animals are subjected to heat stress, especially cattle, they sweat and they lose electrolytes. If we know next week is going to have a week of heat stress, we can mix our licks or our supplements to cattle to include those electrolytes. So we make provision. You are going to lose the electrolytes, but it's already in your licks. You're going to supplement it. You're not going to suffer from heat stress. Medium to long term, if we know the next season is going to be hot and dry, let's warn farmers to get rid of their old and unproductive cows. Don't wait until they are so thin they must be removed from a bucky, from a property. Sell them while they can still walk to the auction. Secondly, we know that heat stress compromises the fertility of especially bulls. 1 or 2 days of heat stress can influence the fertility of unadapted bulls for between 6 and 8 weeks. So if we know the coming breeding season or mating season is going to have a lot of heat stress, let's inform farmers, use multiple sire mating or use bulls from adapted genotypes so that at least you'll get your cow pregnant. And then the last one that I think I've skipped there was if we have early warning systems, we can produce vaccines or medication for disease outbreaks that may be linked to hotter or warmer climates. Okay, then the second one is alternative breeding objectives. It's divided into two. The first one is improved cow efficiency, and the other one will be post-weaning efficiency, which I'm going to talk about. But how do we increase the weaning weight of a calf in relation to the cow's body weight or large stock unit in extensive beef production systems? We came up with a formula. We say cow efficiency is the weaning weight of the calf divided by the cow's large stock unit. Why we use large stock unit? That's an indication of the daily feed intake of the cow, because under extensive conditions, we can't measure the feed intake of the cow. But if we have a body weight of the cow, we can estimate the daily energy needs of the cow. Because large stock units is linked to the carrying capacity, we can even estimate the kilogram calf wean per hectare. And that's what we want to approve. It's not a kilogram calf wean or the weaning weight of the calf. We want to increase the kilogram calf wean per hectare. And that, if we can select for that, we will also lower the methane intensity. Okay, the other one is measures of post-weaning efficiency. Traditionally, feed conversion ratio is used, which is the amount of feed consumed divided by the body weight, and that can be between 6 kilograms of feed to gain 1 kilogram of body weight, or 5 kilograms of feed. The problem with that is it's changed by either improving growth rate or reducing feed intake, or changing both, but we don't know what we're changing. So we're selecting for something that we don't know what we're changing. Therefore, we've come up with alternative measures of efficiency, and I see the R of residual feed intake has disappeared there, but the residual feed intake is improved by reducing the feed intake without changing the growth rate. So the animal will maintain its growth, but it will eat less. Residual daily gain, on the other side, is the feed intake is maintained, but the animal grows faster. And it was found that low residual feed intake animals produce less methane, and they also eat less than high residual feed intake animals, so you will breed more efficient cows. And if you want to, you can combine the two in a selection index. But your minister this morning mentioned you've got this artificial insemination centers that identify the good bulls and then use that semen. But I want to ask him, how do you know it's a good bull? What do you identify in that bull? Botswana, should you not look at bulls with low residual feed intake, which means the animal is going to maintain its performance and growth, but it's going to eat less? Is that not what you want in Botswana and in many other countries of Africa? Or say, well, I've got enough feed, but I can't increase the feed, so I want this animal must grow faster on the same amount of feed. And if we have, we can estimate the residual feed intake and the residual daily gain, and then we can decide which bulls will fit which environment for the African continent, not for other areas. Okay, the other one is alternative production systems. That's crossbreeding. Crossbreeding is practiced widely in the world. I don't think it's always done properly, but if it's done effectively, you can increase cow productivity without increasing herd cost. And there are a number of examples. A Brahman bull on Afrikaner cow, and that's research that was done at the Fallards Research Station in the Northern Cape. Brahman bull on Afrikaner cows, the cow productivity increased by 12%. Simmentaler on Afrikaner, 15%. Angus bull on Nguni cows increases the cow productivity by 21%. That's a fifth. If you use the F1 Afrikaner cow productivity can increase by up to 49% because you get much more milk from the cow and much more fertile. It's just, and that's perhaps why the Bonsmara is so popular in South Africa, because it was developed from Afrikaner cows. And if you increase cow productivity, you reduce the carbon footprint of the product. Then we have an example of the Charolais cross Afrikaner, and you can see there was an increase in 27% in the value of the meat, and 27% less feed was consumed from weaning to harvest. The lady there is Razi Khorshidi, a student from Iran that did a PhD in Canada, and part of it she analyzed South Africa's data. So the results on the Afrikaner Charolais is part of her studies. Next one. Okay, epigenetics. Epigenetics is where the phenotype changes, but the genes don't change. And it was first discovered during the Second World War, where in the Netherlands, women were malnourished. their children had defects when they were born, and those defects were actually also transferred to their children and to their children's children. So although it was a environmentally introduced defect, it was carried over generations, and it seems that it's alterations in the DNA function or DNA methylation that is actually resulting in epigenetics. Bhavini, where are you? Bhavini, there she's at the back. She did her master's on this, so if you want to know more, you can speak to her. But what happens here is that environmental factors changes the performance or the expression of a trait, but the genes are not changing. So it's actually an induced change in performance, and it's transferred to the progeny. So the question is, can we use soft or epigenetic inheritance to fine-tune the performance of the next generation? Because if we want to use Mendelian selection, it will take us a few generations to change the performance of the animal. But by using DNA methylation or epigenetics, we can perhaps do it in one generation, but we still need a lot of research on this. Okay, we know the greenhouse gas emission or the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere has reached all-time highs. What we do now will only, methane has got an environmental lifetime of 12 years, or CO2 of 100 years. So what we save now on methane or CO2, we're only going to see the effect in 12 years or in 100 years. So what's a short-term solution? We must suck carbon dioxide out of the air. We must remove it. And only agriculture can do it. And that is through soil carbon retention, soil carbon sequestration, and then the correct application of short rotational grazing. So what I'm saying, agriculture can bring a short-term solution to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions, because agriculture is the only industry that can suck carbon dioxide from the air. There is investigations to manufacture fuel from using the CO2 in the atmosphere, but at this stage it's not cost effective. So agriculture is the short-term solution. Okay, carbon footprint of different resource environments. We know in Africa, and especially Southern Africa, we've got feedlots. We produce meat from commercial grass-fed, but we also have communal farmers. We need to estimate the carbon footprint of those three different production systems so that we know what is the carbon footprint of each one. We can't lump them and make decisions on that. Okay, I said something about the water footprint. The problem is there's limited information available on the water footprint, and people make assumptions without based on proper data. There is a whole session in which water footprint will be addressed, but the important thing is we should distinguish between the blue water footprint, that's the water that the animal is drinking. The green water, that's the water that the grass is using to grow to feed the animal. Feedlot water, which is often ignored. How much water is needed to produce the feedlot feed that the animal is consuming? People will tell you, well, feedlots are using the byproducts of human food, but still it will have a water footprint. And then important, the grey water. The grey water is the amount of water that's needed to dilute the polluted water from an abattoir or a feedlot so that it can go into the normal streams as well. And I think that is totally underestimated. How much water must you add to the runoff from an abattoir so that that water can go into the river without polluting the river? Next one, okay. Rumen manipulation. We know that there are rumen microbes in the rumen, and they influence the amount of methane produced. Some rumen organisms produce less methane than others, so it's important that we understand that. And then results at the University of the Free State indicated that the rumen microorganisms of Afrikaner cows that weaned heavier calves were different from those of Afrikaner cows that weaned lighter calves. They were managed exactly the same, they were grazing the same field. Why would the animals that weaned heavier calves have different rumen microbes than those that weaned lighter calves? It must have to do something with genetics, and we should look at that as well. Okay, the use of land and greenhouse gases. I think what is often ignored is that our grazing ruminants, under extensive conditions of Africa, they use grassland trees and shrubs. So they are not competing with any other product. Whereas our monogastrics use arable land. Pigs and poultry, the food that they are consuming, that land can be used to produce food for human consumption. So grazing ruminants are not in competition with human food, but monogastrics are. And as I said, ruminants produce methane that's got a short atmospheric lifetime, and that is often used as a reason why we should cut on ruminant production, because we're going to have a faster reduction in greenhouse gases. My argument is let's rather suck the carbon dioxide from the air by improving our ruminant production systems. Okay, management is also important. We need better herd management. Why? We want to increase the outputs. Important, we want to reduce the use of antibiotics. Under Botswana conditions, that might not be that important, but under more commercial conditions, the antibiotics are overused to keep the animals healthy. Rather improve the herd management so that you can reduce the use of antibiotics. And then, of course, animal welfare is becoming more and more important. So we need better herd management, that is to improve outputs, reduce the use of antibiotics, animal welfare, but also better pasture management so that we can rehabilitate our pastures. Some of them have degraded a lot. And my last of the 13 is food quality, loss and waste. As I said, in Africa, the food loss and waste is higher at the production stage. That's during production and post-harvest. And that is true for all low-income countries. But I've skipped the first point now there. Animal source foods is important for early childhood development. So if we want to make sure the children from Africa are developing properly, they should get more animal source foods. And that is why it's important that we should limit the loss of food in the harvesting and post-harvest. In high-income countries, the loss is during consumption. People throw away half of the rice they've cooked, they throw away the cabbages they cooked, and things like that. In countries like France, they are now restaurants, and people are prohibited to throw away the food that was not consumed. They must donate it to somebody that can use it. But in Africa, we have a big challenge. How do we limit food loss and waste? My question is, if we look at livestock, will something like mobile abattoirs reduce the loss of meat in rural areas? I don't know, but the scientists must come up with a solution. So my conclusion is, scientists must develop and manage the interventions that I listed, the 13, in order to contribute to transformation, adaptation, mitigation, and resilience, because those are all essential for the sustainability of African animal agriculture. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Prof. I think you've highlighted a number of issues, the need for us to, for research on Africa to inform our decisions here, and for us to collaborate, and that we need the Global South to cooperate even amongst themselves. You've highlighted some of, debunked some of the untruths or the false statistics that are presented on our situation. And you've given some tips on some of the bridging objectives that we need to take into account and what other interventions that we can take to improve the situation. So at this juncture, when you started off, you said you can say anything you want. And I heard you when you said agriculture sucks. And of course, you qualify that to say is that it sucks the carbon dioxide. So anyway, at this juncture, we are going to give a chance to the presenters who were in this session to come to the front, and then we can have a general discussion. This will be led by Professor Mishek Chagunda. So if some ushers, you can help me just put some chairs here for them so that they can face the crowd, the audience, so that then we can get going on this session where we can have questions and interventions based on the presentations that we've heard from this morning. Unfortunately, we are unable to have Professor Rege, who was online, but we will have the speakers who are in here to just intervene on the issues based on the comments that will come from the floor. Over to you, Mishek, to take over from here for this session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, my brother and friend, Podisi. To transform or not to transform, ladies and gentlemen, that is not the question. And the three presenters this morning have demonstrated that very ably, that indeed that is not the question. African livestock systems need to transform. The African livestock sector need to change. There is no need to flip-flop around this issue. The African livestock system needs to transform in order to add its contribution to the Agenda 63. We've also heard that the African livestock system needs to transform in order to make that smallholder farmer, in order to make that large-scale farmer, in order to make that pastoralist extract the optimal benefit from the livestock production systems. We've also heard that the African livestock system needs to transform in order for those 55 million stunted young people to have the benefit of nutrition from livestock, the benefit of having those nutrients that cannot sometimes be obtained from crop-based foods, nutrients like vitamin B12, zinc, iron. We also know, and we've heard, that the African livestock sector needs to transform in order to be inclusive, in order to be demographic sensitive, and also in order to be just. The livestock production system in Africa needs to transform in order to be sustainable. In order not only to be sustainable to produce food, but also to contribute to human health, to contribute to the environmental health, and indeed to contribute to the health of the livestock themselves. All this requires robust science, it requires robust research, it requires data, it requires evidence, and indeed it requires a clear voice. My name is Mishek Chagunda. I'm a professor of animal breeding and husbandry in the tropics and subtropics at the University of Hohenheim in Germany. I'll be the facilitator and moderator for this session. The floor is now open to you to ask questions, comments, and indeed queries to our presenters. We'll take the first 5. Please indicate your name, indicate to whom the question is being addressed, including Professor Ed Reggae. We will note those down, although they may not be addressed immediately. And then we would have another round of discussion after those first 5. So who wants to get the first chance to ask a question or comment or indeed to pose their queries? The floor is open. We have some revolving microphones and they'll come to you. I can see 2 hands up already on that side and a third one there. So 1, 2, 3, we can have 2 more. There's another one there, that's the 4th one. And we have the 5th one. Is that a hand up at the back? No, there is one at the back. So let's take those 2, that one there, this one here, and that one there, and then we'll respond to those. There are 2 hands at the back there, so just start, please.
Okay, thank you so much, Chair. Actually, I would like to thank the presenter for the nice presentation. Actually, my question is for Professor concerning the early warning issue. The early warning issue is very important, specifically in semi-arid environment, and which informs our members. But most of the time, the livestock owners are very reluctant, and they like their livestock to take action, and then how that can be maybe more effective. The other issue is about the issue of carrying capacity. Carrying capacity, adjusting the number of animals to the available resource is very important to increase the meat per hectare. But because of the uncertainty of the environment, the climate, variability, extremity of the environment, most African rangeland, that is impossible. And because the external factors sometimes control the system rather than adjusting the internal management. So how that can be maybe improved. Maybe also...
Could we limit one question to a person, please? So you've already asked 2. Let's move on to the back.
Good afternoon. My name is Edwin from Illinois. This question goes to Professor Endrage, but also the other presenters. So, how do you balance the introduction and adoption of GM organisms vis-a-vis the conservation of biodiversity and especially the indigenous genetic resources that we know have other socio-economic benefits, and also considering the justice, diversity, equity and inclusion, and also on the other side we ensure that through crossbreeding we can also increase the production, because I think one of the aims of introducing GM organisms is to increase production. So how do we balance that, those 2 aspects?
Thank you very much. Let's move to that side. There was a hand up before we go in front.
Thank you to the presenters. That was good. My name is Scholastica Wambua. I work for Calro in Kenya. And my question is to Professor Ed Reggae. My concern is the issue to do with communication about GM products. That was his last recommendation, communication. But my background is agribusiness management. I support GM because I have some little knowledge about it. What about the smallholder farmers and the laymen who don't even understand what this GM is? What can we do really to simplify and explain to the smallholder farmers who are supposed to produce this what GM is?
Thank you very much. There was a hand up there. That will be the 5th question.
Thank you very much to the presenters. My name is Chinyere Ikinijibenu. I work as a scientist at the International Livestock Research Institute, Nairobi, Kenya. So my question is just really following up on what the lady who spoke before me said. It's when for Prof. Reggae when he said that in the United States they had similar fears around the GM, and but now have adapted to it. So how were these fears dealt with, and can we learn from what they did to address such narcissism? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Because I already promised the chief there to have a question, please go ahead. Is that you? Yes. So the president himself. The president of All Africa Society.
Thank you, Vivek. My question goes to my sister on justice. The concept of justice is fairness. In a world which is unfair, I like the concept, I like the way you presented it, but how can we achieve justice? Because some are already advantageous over the other. Are you advocating revolution? Because you know what? Some of the things that are really beautiful. But in this unfair world, asking for fairness, sitting in a room like this, might not work. Can you shed light on this?
Thank you very much. Could you pass on that microphone to me, please, so that our presenters can respond? Thank you. Would you take the first question, which was on the early warning systems, and then you take the second one, which is on justice. We'll leave those for Ed to see if you can handle those as well.
Okay, I hope I understand the question on early warning systems correctly. What we see is that, especially from the Agricultural Research Council sites in South Africa, that we can develop an app that farmers can download, and they will get information on the climate and heat stress issues in the next 10 to 14 days. The issue is to get accurate information from the different weather stations, but it seems that it's possible to develop an app that all farmers can use, and it will be, of course, per region. So it will tell you this area might experience heat stress, that area not. So we see that by having these electrolytes in small bags, or plastic bags that can be bought from stores that supply animal feeds, surely it can assist the farmers to mitigate the effect of short-term heat stress. The second one was on the carrying capacity. I know that is a very complex issue, and I think that is where the scientists on the ground that's working with the farmer from day to day, they must come up with a solution. How do we manage the grazing depending on the different systems that apply so that we can increase the carrying capacity? We had a project with a mining company some years ago in KwaZulu-Natal. They were mining granite in a communal area, and they asked, but what can we put in back into the community? And our suggestion was to them, there's no fences here, the cattle grazes wherever they want. Put in watering points in 4 areas, and then you close 3 of them. So the cattle concentrate on the area where there's water. When they finish that grass, you close that watering point, move to another watering point, the cattle automatically move, so you can have controlled grazing, even in a communal area where there's no fences. But the people at ground level are the people that must work out how that should be done, and that's why scientific information is very important. Thank you for the question.
Thank you very much. We move on. Are you insinuating?
Thank you, Professor, for your question. That's a very loaded question. Am I insinuating a revolution? So in thinking about, I'm asking for fairness, or proposing that we as a community think about fairness in an unfair world, and how do we move forward? I know one thing is we can't continue in the way we're continuing now. We've heard uncovered so many of the problems, and so it's clear that we're not meeting the challenges that we're already aware of. And so in moving forward, I talked about both equity and justice, and I want to say that there's a place for both of these as we're thinking about, do we need a revolution? So equity is suggesting short-term changes. What can we do right now to meet the challenges where they are? That would be like, if you show up today and you have a cold, and I say, my brother, you should get some rest, right? That's the first sort of equity solution. When we're thinking about justice, is there's an infection that's going on. So as much rest as you take will never fully resolve you of your cold if we only say drink some hot tea and get some rest. We have to treat what's going on at the root level. And I think a lot of times as scientists, funding bodies, kind of the entire scientific enterprise, we focus on only treating the surface level symptoms, the cold. We give you a cup of tea, we say rest, but we don't go to those root level that we know are the problems and that may require a revolution of sorts. And so what I say to those of us here who do have power and position in policies, in creating change, it starts with you deciding to be vocal about the things that you know we need to be changing instead of only diverting to the short-term solutions that are helpful but will only continue to make the problem bigger and bigger, especially as we're facing some of these challenges with climate change, the sixth mass extinction, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's a short answer to a much longer conversation, and I'll be here throughout the week and happy to continue meeting with people one-on-one or in small groups to continue discussing how do we strive for fairness in this unfair world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There are 3 questions that were addressed to Professor Ed Reggae, all of them dealing with how do we balance the introduction of GMs and the economic benefits and the just benefits. How do we communicate these issues in simple language? And also, how do we learn from others to deal with the fears? Does any one of you want to deal with any of those questions? Or somebody in the audience? Yep, sure. She would like to address something a little bit about fear. So in Professor Edrige's presentation, he mentioned some work which was done in the USA, indicating that people were really very fearful about it. But then what can we learn from that? Or what can we learn from others to deal with fear of this GMO kind of stuff?
I think that's such a great philosophical question when we're talking about fear, because we're getting at, do we trust the information that's being given to us, right? So we're afraid of the things we don't understand. And I think that's where we have a responsibility, not just to relay the information in a way that's accessible, but to take as much time as is needed to allow people to trust that information, to build respectful relationships. So, for example, in the US and even in my country, the Dominican Republic, there is a history of colonization, of researchers coming in and taking things without a benefit coming back to the community where they have come into. So they make a lot of promises as researchers about what we're going to do and how this will help the community, but then that doesn't happen. And so we can then understand why a community might say, no, I'm afraid of that, I'm fearful, I don't want this so-called science because you've eliminated me completely from the conversation. So how, as a community, can we expect the people that we're saying, this is for you, right? We don't do science only to answer a question. That's certainly a really strong part, and we're curious as scientists, but we say that we're doing the science for the benefit of people. But if we don't bring that benefit back and we don't allow for that conversation and trust to happen over time, it's going to result in fear. And so I spoke to you about ethics and how we all have ideas of what's right and wrong. So we as people in science have an idea, but what does the community think? And so I think it requires moving at the pace of trust, which is something in the grand scheme of the scientific enterprise that we're not very good at, right? So we say publish or perish. It has to be today, be the first, do this, do this, do this, but then it doesn't translate. And so we're cutting off the very people that we want to serve. And so I'll say that about fear for now and look forward to what Professor Reggie will ask that.
You've actually addressed the fear question very well, and also you started touching on the communication question that was raised on how do we communicate this to smallholder farmers and even to the person on the street. I guess that question goes beyond communicating GMOs. It is about how do we communicate science as in general. In that case, I would want to kind of volunteer Kadesa to kind of tell us a little bit more. So my colleague, Dr. Podese, may want to address that a little bit.
Thank you, Major. Yes, I think the issue of communication has been touched on in a bit by Professor Tadele Desi when earlier in his comments when he highlighted the issue of that our focus as scientists should not just be about publishing papers, but we should address this issue of knowledge translation. How do we put things in a perspective that can be understood by the common man on the street? It's a challenge that we all have to work on, and it's a science which we need to develop the capacity for. We've noted that sometimes scientists, you do your very high-level papers in your high-impact journals, but you leave out, there's a gap of having people who are trained to demystify the key message which is coming out of those research papers. And sometimes it involves even just simple things like writing common media articles in your newspapers, going on radio, going on TV. Most scientists get petrified if we should tell them to go on TV to be interviewed by journalists. They say they don't want to be misquoted, but this is the only way that we can convince the customers, our stakeholders, even for them to support science. As CADESA, we periodically try to lobby policymakers to invest more in science, but we need to find a way in which we can convince how science is impacting lives by even convincing the men on the streets how the science of agriculture is actually putting food on their table, is helping to solve the nutritional challenges that our communities are facing. There's the other issue of bringing the transparency. Somebody highlighted the issue about the information that we get. You saw that even with the COVID vaccines, how people develop so much mistrust about science, despite the fact that we've seen how science has helped communities. We are using cell phones. These are products of science investigation. Professor Edrege highlighted how we are consuming medical products which are actually used, the same techniques that are used for producing food under GM technologies, that probably we need to just find a way in which we can try to demystify some of the key findings. And it's a science which we need to cultivate in our institutions. How researchers talk to the communicators, the extension personnel, some of them, they can even hardly decipher the key messages out of our research publications because it's communicating at a level which they don't understand, and therefore leaving out the farmers. I think that is something that we need to work on. It's a gap, the issue of knowledge translation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's take the second round of questions. Oh, there is a comment on that.
Sorry to come back to the GMOs. What are we going to do if the European Union decides they are not going to import meat from cattle that have been dehorned? So we have a choice. If we want animals without horns, we can use the gene from Poland and transfer it into Botswana cattle, and they will breed Poland animals. Or we can use an Angus bull, which will also give Poland animals but will not be adapted. So is it really, what health issues can be related to using the Pole gene and putting it into the Tswana cattle? That's genetically modified, but what will be the negative impact of it? And I think that is why we need proper communication.
Yep. We have two hands up at the back. So we take 1, 2, and there's the third one right there. So let's take those 3, and there are 2 here. let's take those two to have a group of 5 questions. So we start this way, and then we'll go that way. Yep. We'll start on my right, and then we'll go to the left.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed all 3 presentations, and I would like to thank the presenters. My name is German Kase. I'm an economist, and I work for Ricardo, and I'm based in Rabat, Morocco. I wish Ed was online because I had a question for him, but I'll try to reach him out. So my question is for our guest from the Dominican Republic, and then I would have a comment for the professor. So my question is, it's a bit broad. So are there any opportunities or probably incentives that you think the privileged group is still benefiting out of while the non-privileged scientists or students are not able to have access to? So I would like you to comment on that, if you may. Prof, I really like your point about the indigenous genetic resources, the indigenous breeds. And another important point that I liked is the way you presented this, I call it toxic science, which is blaming the livestock sector for the greenhouse gas emissions. So what do you think is the source of that disparity you showed? I mean, some estimated like 18% and others like 5.4. So from your perspective, I would like you to comment where you think that disparity is coming from. Is it the assumptions? Is it the quantity they are putting in? Or is it, the negligence in terms of the feed efficiency that you referred to? Thank you.
Right, there's another hand up right there at the back as well.
Thank you to all the presenters for the nice presentation. My name is Zahra Mohammed Hassan. I'm originally from South Sudan, but here representing the University of South Africa. My question is to Dr. Sadie, and I hope I'm saying your name correctly. The issue of injustice, again, taking you back. A lot of time when we work with women, we realize that women are actually workers in the land. Okay. That women are workers on the land. They don't own the land. The issue of empowerment of women, we realize that when the family is farming together and then the purpose is to just increase the production, it works very well. But when it comes to commercialization, because women don't own the land, then it becomes the issue. So my question is, based on your experience, what are the practical approaches that can actually help women own lands in terms of policies in different African countries? Thank you.
We move on to the front line before we then go to the left.
Thank you and good afternoon, Professor Sajay. My question relates to stakeholder consultation. When I look at your model, the JD that looks at justice equity, did you coin it after consultation with the stakeholders, or is one of those top-down approaches? For example, we had for a long time, transformation is the buzzword, and now we have moved into inclusive growth, especially on the African context, running away from the term transformation. And transformation is coming from top-down approach, which is more public sector related, and then inclusive growth, we see it emanating from the private sector. And from the research side, we're seeing you coming with JD. So who is being consulted? Is this a grassroots thing, or is also a top-down that will also be replaced in the next 5 years? Thank you.
Thank you. Let's take those 2 hands up at the back there. Yes, please.
All right, thank you so much. So to Dr. Sadeh, my question is, from your experience, what gender disparities have you come across that actually slowed down the progression of young people wanting to participate in animal agriculture? And the second question is, how do you
if we can actually make agriculture more attractive to young people. Thank you.
Right, let's take one more hand right there. Yep, exactly. I'm pointing at you, but thank you.
Thank you. My name is Simba Sibanda from Fanapan, originally a livestock or animal nutritionist, but now focusing more on the politics of development. My question is to Dr. Sajay. I don't know whether I call it a question or a comment, but when we talk about decolonizing, people talk about the Roman Empire's demise, but I would say the Roman Empire is still in existence today because all they managed to do was to make sure that the subsequent generations would imbibe the Roman way of thinking. This part of the world with what we call the Roman Dutch law. So our laws are very much based on the Roman practices going back there, mixed of course with the Dutch colonialists. And this is what we use as our basis for justice. Now, if you want to decolonize, you're gonna have to make sure, because right now what's happening is Botswana is celebrating Independence Day in a couple of days' time. However, colonialism is very much alive in Botswana and in many other African countries without the colonial master being present. So how do we unravel that? We have to get to the root of this whole thing to make sure that subsequent generations are indeed decolonized. My generation, our value system, the metrics that we use for development, this, even to measure the success of science is all based on the colonizers' value system, what they think is success, not what we think is success. So I don't know whether it's a revolution or it's evolution.
Thank you very much, Prof. Sivanda. We have more than 5 questions, actually. And the majority of them are going to Dr. Pierce. I will give you the first word, and then we'll come to Prof. Michael Scott to answer his question as well.
Thank you for all of these wonderful questions. And now I'm thinking we should have breakout groups to discuss amongst ourselves, because I think the comment that the last gentleman brought up holds really true of we're still living in the colonizer's mind, even if they're physically not here. And so how do we disentangle something that is entrenched if we don't become aware of it? And so I do think, so I'm going to jump to your question about the model. And so what we're trying to do with this model is to unravel or to bring this to light, that it isn't simple. It's not going to be one thing to disentangle. So what we're trying to do is put justice at the beginning, right? So in science, so much we jump to the how. So in my presentation, I talked about why this matters, what we can do, and where are there opportunities. I never went to the how. I didn't propose systems. I didn't say, here's a checklist. I offered instead, or what I attempted to do was to offer a new way of thinking of, by putting justice first and then people second, what I'm suggesting is that we need to have a revolution where we're reconsidering what is success. We fall into these patterns sometimes without even thinking about it. We have assumptions about what is fair and what is right, and this is the law. But whose law is it, right? And so we automatically jump to fulfilling the law without questioning, but who wrote the law? And does the law take into account all of the people? And so in thinking about, someone then asked about women or youth and how do we get them in? Are they included when we're thinking about these laws and sustainability, not just in animal production, but in their livelihoods and what matters to them? So a question, and you in the audience may know better, why would the youth get into animal agriculture? Is there sustainability for them in their career trajectory? Is that attractive to them compared to other opportunities that might be more enticing? And if it isn't, then that's where we start digging into, well, why not? And what is going on at those levels that is preventing youth from entering science, or they enter and become disillusioned and dropped out? And when when we're thinking about women and empowering women, especially as we're thinking about, I think the question was about commercialization, and yet they don't have ownership. And so that again points or highlights a problem in that we're expecting them to produce and contribute to sustainability without actually having their voice and their concerns and their position be a part of the conversation. And so positioning and who we are and the power we have makes a big difference. And so with this model, the second lens was looking at the individual, and then the individual in a relationship with someone else that's interpersonal, and then within a community, and then an organization, which is a lot of communities together, all the way to the societal level. So we can look at justice through all these different relationships that me, let's say as an individual, might have with one other person in this community here, in a large organization, within the society of Africa, and then look at one particular aspect of this problem. But then we have to come back to the entire system and think about how does it fit in with the entirety of the problem that's going on. So Professor, we may need a revolution and we may need you to help lead it, because if we only focus again on sort of giving one woman, let's say, a farm and giving ownership instead of looking at the entire system of why aren't women considered farm owners, we're never going to change the problem. We're never going to reach fairness in any way if we don't question what we even call fair to begin with. Did I miss any questions?
You actually dealt with all of the questions. Thank you. Thank you very much. Let's move on to the issue of indigenous breeds, the toxic science around that, and also where are all these disparities in data coming from?
Thank you. Yes, I think with climate change, we're going to realize that indigenous breeds are becoming more and more important. I've got a presentation later in the week where I will indicate that indigenous breeds are more resilient to climate change than the exotic breeds, and it depends on how much additional feed you want to put in, but your production from the indigenous and the adapted breeds may be on the long term, be on par, even better than that of the more exotic breeds. The disparity in values, I think it's because people look at different production systems without quantifying what are the inputs in that production system. For example, for the tier 2 information or formula, the animal weight is not taken into consideration. They just look at animal numbers. And of course, if you say 100 cows from Ethiopia weighs the same as 100 cows from Britain, the Ethiopian cows will have a much higher footprint per unit product because they are much smaller. But those equations does not take animal size or the feed intake into account. And we've done some studies using those IPPC formulas, and we realized if you put in body weight, there's an optimum weight that gives you, if animals are too small, the carbon footprint is higher. If they are too big, the carbon footprint is higher as well. So I think we should look at the total system and put in everything into the system. Another problem is they only look at part of the system. What will happen to grass if it's not eaten by ruminants? It will burn and produce a lot of carbon dioxide, or that has got an atmospheric lifetime of more than 100 years, or it will rot, that will produce nitrous oxide that's got a global warming potential of 293 times that of carbon dioxide. So the worst thing that can happen with grass is not to be consumed by livestock. Because as the livestock consume the grass, yes, they produce methane, but with the regrowth of the grass, carbon dioxide is sucked from the air. And people doing these calculations just look at part of the system. They don't look at the total production cycle. And that's why we get all these funny figures.
We have time for 2 quick questions. And in the interest of fairness, I'll go this direction. And I would like to request if those two last questions are addressed to the presenters that are here as well. So there is a hand up there. And who wants to take the last one? There was a quick hand up there, so we'll take these two. Yes, please, go for it, Christian.
So thank you very much for your presentation. My question actually goes to Professor Schultz, or maybe it's not really a question, it's a comment because you've been talking about the IPCC guidelines, and I've been working with them also a bit, and I agree that they over or underestimate depending on the system, but the issue of the body weight not being taken into consideration, in my experience, that's not been the case. It's actually taken into consideration, and for each production system, you normally are supposed to use a body weight that is defined, an average body weight. So, am I getting it wrong that you didn't see this, or what is the point?
All right, let's move to the last question there.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for saying it, and thank you to this young man. I think with this kind of discussion, you need at least a voice from a farmer. My name is Apele Kiriro. I'm a farmer from Kenya, and I'm also a farmer leader of the East African Farmers Federation, which is also a member of the Pan-African Farmer Organization. I think the issues raised by the presenters are very important. They were double-edged. They touched on some of the issues that we raised as lobby groups. But I would like to make it very clear as to why we don't agree. We don't disagree because we are anti the technologies, the GMs. No, it is the rebellion. Because the question here is, we farmers, and especially the small-scale farmers, have actually been taking up technologies from our conventional breeders. And if you look at the gains and how much we are actually able to exploit the same, it's minimal. Like we go to field days during the shows, we have the maize breed. This can give you 40 bags per acre or per half a hectare. We farmers are actually getting 10 or 12 or 15. So the issue here for us is, what is the problem? Why do you tell me about this other technology when this other one here, I'm not able to actually exploit 40% of it? How is it actually going to solve my problems around extension, the money, the soils, the water, many of the issues that are actually very important to me as a farmer? So I think for us is, can we actually get the issues raised as farmers right first in terms of support before we can actually transit into this other technology? Because it also requires servicing, it requires extension, it requires money, and many other issues that are actually supposed to actually cost farmers a lot of money and support. So I think that is our concern. We have not been able to do well with what is already there.
Yeah.
And here you are. Can we actually work on the basics first? And we get it right, so that when we actually move to this other side, we are moving there because we have actually hit the limit, and we are ready for this other. We can actually be able to manage the challenges that actually come with it. Thank you.
Really wonderful to have the word of a farmer. And actually, you were posing questions, but as a matter of fact, those were comments and food for thought. In which case, I don't think we need to address each one of those, but really go away and think about those questions. Really thank you for that. But before we close, I would like to give a word to Professor Scholes, just to kind of comment on that comment on, is Christian Bateki getting you wrong, or is there something fundamentally different about this body weight issue?
No, thank you. The tier 1 and 2 equations does not make provision for body weight. It's only the tier 3 equation that makes provision for body weight. But then for that body weight, you also need a methane emissions factor, whether you measure it in a respiration chamber or with a laser methane detector or with a green feed system, which makes it more complicated. But tier 1 and tier 2 does not have body weights in their formula.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, at this point, I would like you to join me in thanking all the presenters and, of course, also the farmer who made really these vital comments, and to yourselves for all the contributions. Let me hand over to my colleague, Baitsi Podisi, to close this session, because I now realize I'm standing in between you and your lunch. Thank you very much. I hand over to my colleague.
Thank you, Mijek. Let me thank the presenters from Professor Ed Rege, who presented online, and our two presenters who are now on the stage. As a token of appreciation, we have a small token of appreciation that we want to give to them in appreciation for their presentations. I hope I have the right one. This is for Michael. This one is for... Yes. This one? Yeah, this is for Michael. Yeah. Yes. And this other one is for Prof. Ed. We'll see how we get it over to him. Thank you very much. Well, as we allow our presenters to take their seats, I'm just going to pass some key announcements as we end this session. Of course, thanking you since morning for your cooperation in getting this event started. We'll be heading out for lunch, and as we head out for lunch, we'll be using there's a tent outside where we'll be having our lunch. And I just want to request that after lunch, we'll be convening here for the parallel sessions. This place is going to be subdivided into 3 parallel sessions. And you are requested to take your personal effects, because we are going to subdivide the room, and the rooms will be well labeled to indicate the session and the topic, the main theme for such a theme. Therefore, you'll find the labeling on the door so that you are able to identify your space. I want to take this opportunity now to thank everybody and say I thank you for your cooperation in getting this work started, and all the presenters, the organizers, and you deserve to go for lunch. Thank you very much. Yes, and for the VIPs, you have your room upstairs where you had your tea break. The VIPs, there's a special room for you upstairs where you had your tea break. Thank you.